Morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the second webinar in a series of 6 or 7 that are running from the last one was beginning of August, running all the way through into the spring. And today's session will be focusing on cybersecurity and risk and considering how likely an attack is. I'm just going to wait a few more moments for some more people to join, and then we will get going. Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to today's session. So today's webinar is very much about considering the reality of cybercrime and cyber attacks, and realistically, how likely is it that your organization might suffer a cyber attack at any time or in the next 12 months? And we're also going to consider, as part of that, the psychology of risk, if you will, in terms of how and why individuals or organizations consider or assess risks and decide whether they need to do something about them or not. And that's why we have one of our guests today here specifically. So we're going to focus on 4 key areas. We're going to look at the latest cybercrime data and some trends, some of which are quite scary, to be honest. We'll look at the likelihood of a cyber attack in relation to the latest data that's available on that. Then we'll take a bit of a deep dive into the psychology of risk and how as individuals we weigh up risk and decide whether to address it or not, as the case may be, which will segue into talking about leadership and leaders and how they manage risk or consider risk or make decisions on behalf of their organization. And then towards the end, we'll just talk about something which More Clearcom is going to offer everyone who's registered for today's webinar as a free digital cyber risk report on your organization. My name is Rich Jackson. I'm the Strategic Business Manager at More Clearcom. I'm joined by my colleague Maritz Kloter and Mike Clark of Empowered People Thrive. Maritz, would you just give us a little bit of a brief intro on yourself, and then Mike, if you could follow, that would be lovely.
Thank you.
Cool. So hello everybody, my name is Maritz. As Rich mentioned, I'm Director of Cybersecurity and IT Assurance Services at More Clearcom. My team, I've got a team of cybersecurity specialists, and I'm a cybersecurity practitioner myself as well. And we've sort of been in the field for probably now on about 20 years now. So we've got a little bit of experience to draw upon for this conversation as well. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Looking forward to the rest of this webinar.
Thanks, Maritz.
My name's Mike Clark. I run a company called Empower People Thrive. I've been empowering people and supporting them since 2007. Specialisms are emotional intelligence and behavioral sciences, and the kind of things that you would ordinarily find me doing, other than guest speaking spots like this, would be things like teaching, training, coaching, and mentoring individuals, and they can come from all different backgrounds, so it doesn't just have to be in the workplace. We work with a wide range of people from just ordinary life, if you like. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Mike. And Mike and I go back quite a long way, and we've been having these cybersecurity, human psychology conversations for some time now. So I know that today's going to be really interesting, and I'm really excited about what we might uncover today. So let's start with the latest cyber attack data. A nice quote there from Niels Bohr about prediction, especially if it's about the future. It's kind of obvious, but actually it's quite a powerful statement. I'll take you back 5 years to the World Economic Forum talking about global risks. And it considered that the 3 risks that we would be looking at in terms of global stability over the next 5 years, which is where we are now, 2023, are natural disasters, extreme weather, and cyber attacks. And I think that's all come to fruition. I think that plays true. And the thing that I kind of sense from this is that we can definitely all see and feel natural disasters and extreme weather. It's talked about constantly. It's very much embedded into our psyche now. They impact all of us. But I think that cyber attacks are less tangible. They don't affect everyone, or they haven't been until recently. And it probably makes cybercrime a greater threat than society realizes. I mean, would you think that's fair, Maritz, from our experience at More Clearcom?
Definitely. I think the amount of issues we deal with on a day-by-day basis, and just what we see in the news, really, about large organizations and small organizations suffering cyber attacks of some sort, does actually sort of play out. This is just a continuous threat that's really difficult to get a handle on, and it's not something that we're going to be able to suppress anytime soon. in terms of just getting rid of that attack. So again, like a bit like natural disaster and extreme weather, it's just a pervasive threat that we all need to take into account when we run our businesses.
Yeah, perhaps because it's man-made as such, as opposed to, oh well, we could consider the others are as well.
You could argue the other two are arguably man-made as well.
I sort of fell into that trap myself there. But I think that's all fair, and we've definitely seen that trend evolve. And these stats I mentioned at the very beginning, I've been using stats and data similar to this in webinars for a few years now. This is without doubt the most dramatic set of data that I've put on the screen so far. I won't read these out, but I think there's some evolving sort of trends, and we'll touch on them later in the webinar. We know that cybercrime rose hugely during the peaks of the COVID-19 pandemic for different reasons. AI is definitely now beginning to play its part, as I'll mention later on, in cybercrime, and the cost of cybercrime hitting 8 trillion this year. I think it was only about 18 months ago that I was confirming that it started to exceed the value of the entire global illegal drug trade. It's far surpassing that. It's out on its own. So yeah, really scary stats, and it's definitely something I think that society as a whole has to embrace now. As someone who's not involved in cybersecurity, Mike, how do you feel, and how does this subject hit you or affect you on a day-to-day basis?
Interestingly, when you were talking about the weather and then this sort of man-made thing, we know enough about the weather to recognize when it might be raining or when it might be a storm coming, and we often report on it. I'm kind of with both of what you've said. I think cybersecurity is something that ought to be taken a little bit more seriously. Certainly, it's something for me over the last sort of 4 years or so working with you, Richard, that I've become acutely aware of. It more likely appears in my feed, and these figures are wow. I think the one that you've got on there is that every company is a reachable target. Makes me think, hang on a minute, what do I need to do as well? So it's kind of a real thing. And I guess what's happening at the moment is, for me, as somebody that's not an expert as you two, it seems that when it rains, i.e. there's cyber attacks, not everybody's aware it's raining.
Yeah.
Not everybody's got a pair of galoshes, and nobody's got a brolly and all the other bits that you need to protect yourself. Because you need, a coat, a jacket, a pair of wellies, if it's going to rain. So what is it that we need to do with cybersecurity to do the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that every company is a reachable target is interesting in that, and Moritz and I deal with this a lot, and it comes down to supply chain and the fact that most organizations overlook the fact that they're intrinsically linked with so many other organizations, which makes them more reachable. So businesses are not independent entities that they might have been in the past when they're paper-based organizations. As soon as you go into a technical environment using cloud-based services or software as a service, etc., that all brings us much closer together.
I think just one more point on that one actually is the tip of the iceberg theory, in that, as you say, weather and sort of other adverse physical events get reported regularly. People might not even know that they've been subject to a cyber attack.
Yeah.
Companies who are subject to a cyber attack, there's no commitment to report it to anybody. So if you can manage it internally, you would, because it's a reputational issue, unless it's affected something quite drastically. We probably don't hear or see most of the cyber attacks that are happening there. So those stats are particularly worrying, because that's reported stats. What's the unreported bits that go on? What the bits that people aren't even aware of? That's the bit that's more. And actually, just a segue on that is the US cybersecurity advisory body have just highlighted that China specifically has been hacking into network equipment, and have been, for the last many years, have installed backdoors into the software that runs on networking equipment, and most people won't be aware of that. So if you buy kit offline, like eBay and places like that, then potentially you might be buying equipment that's fundamentally already breached, and you wouldn't know about it. So that's probably something that's quite key to note, is the cyber threat is much more subtle than the other two threats, but it's no less harmful, really, if it does actually turn into a full-blown attack.
Yeah, and I guess the fact that the media reports, when they do occur, tend to be because it's a recognizable name or brand that's been affected, that in a way kind of lends itself to the smaller organizations being reassured that doesn't happen to them, and obviously we know it does, especially with the supply chain element. Yeah, so it's really, we talk about phishing, which is for those who aren't aware, is when you might receive an email with a link in it, or an encouragement to go somewhere where you shouldn't, essentially, and to do something that you shouldn't. It's quite a well-known phrase now. So these are some really interesting numbers, especially the last one, which really shocked me when I saw it the first time. So essentially, 1 in 3 users will click on harmful content in a phishing email. So if we have 100 people that receive an email that has something harmful in it, 1 in 3 people will click that link. And then of those that click, 1 in 2 of those will proceed and continue to enter sensitive information. So that's 16.5% of the original recipients, which is a really high number. And then the next bit really caught my breath. So it's actually digital natives, the younger members of society, that are far more likely to click on phishing emails than the older users, which my assumption would have been that it would have been the older people longer in the tooth like myself, and dare I say it, Maritz, who would be more likely to do that because of a lack of awareness. But actually, it's the younger people that are doing it. And for those who are not familiar with the phrase of digital native, that's someone who essentially grew up in the presence of digital technology, had a phone in their hands from a young age, a smartphone, etc. Very, very comfortable with tech and fluent in it. And I'd be really interested in both your takes on what's going on there, because that, as I said, I would have predicted the complete opposite of that stat.
I think maybe they're just less cynical than us old people, really. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, I think Mertz is right. I think there's cynicism to the way that we were conditioned and brought up in the society we lived in, the school we went to, you know, if it looks too good to be true, then it isn't true, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? Is the way that we were sort of brought up, whereas the younger generation have a completely different approach to the way they live, and so they should, by the way.
Yeah, is that about Mike and I? We've talked a lot in the past on different webinars and podcasts about how we form trust as a young person. Has that possibly changed because these young people are using tech and sort of Instagram and TikTok from a very young age? Is it changed how they view trust? I mean, it's quite a deep subject, I guess. But
for me, it's sort of, how can I put it, without going too much down the road of trust, you know, there are 8 drivers of human trust, and I don't think they change in a human being per se. I think that now everything is immediate. And I think what informs the younger generation is, you know, they're sort of click, you know, trigger happy, whatever you want to call it. They know how to navigate menus, multiple menus on different platforms. And I kind of think that possibly because of the way social media works for them, they're more obedient and compliant, should I say, than possibly you or I would be.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, we're speculating a bit. I think, but you're right. And I think, and if anyone wants to know what the 8 drivers of trust are, Mike's contact details will be provided when we send out the summary of the slides and the Q&A. And I think that's a really good question to ask. Emerging threats and trends. I'll ask Maritz to comment on the last one specifically in a moment, but ransomware is definitely becoming more refined and intelligent. And we're seeing phishing and vishing, which is using voice or telephone normally to carry out an attack, being enabled by AI. And we've had a couple of stories in the media lately where employees have been called up by what they perceive to be their boss or a senior member of the team to carry out something and that they shouldn't, and it's because their voice has been replicated using AI. We see supply chains targeted more and more. Insider threats are definitely on the increase, and the Internet of Things is now becoming weaponized as well. Business email compromise, where an email account is hacked and then emails are sent from that account encouraging staff to do things they shouldn't do, absolutely on the rise. And then there's the Move It attack of this year, which Maritz has the wonderful phrase of the gift that keeps on giving. And we even this week, there's been, I think in Canada, there was it affected a children's hospital, I think, or a healthcare system affected with young people. 3.4 million records of individuals were breached or attacked. Rich, can you just give us shine a light on that and why it's so significant?
So that's actually a classic example of the supply chain risk that we have, and just in terms of using software. So MoveIt is a piece of software that companies use to transfer data between organizations. So it's a bit of software they buy, they install it on their network, and then other people can connect and actually either download data or upload data. So that's why the issue is so big in terms of the companies that use it, because it's a secure way to transfer a lot of personal data, for example. So if there's a regular transfer between companies every month, maybe to a payroll company or to any other sort of companies, a lot of organizations use this MoveIt tool. So what happened is MoveIt, the software had a vulnerability in it, which wasn't identified for quite some time, which allowed an attacker to be able to log into the platform as a user, and then manipulate it to such a way that it actually gives all the data that's ever been used on MoveIt. So essentially, allowing the user to, even if it's an anonymous user or a user with very low level of access, to elevate their own access and gain all the data on the platform. And that's why it's such a big thing. So MoveIt did provide a patch for the software and issued a patch for the software, but it's then up to the companies that use it to apply that patch and to update their software. And if that's not done, this is a publicly known exploit. There are companies, or there are groups out there that specifically look for MoveIt instances across the internet, and they'll try this exploit to see if they can gain access to any data. Because obviously data theft, data is worth a lot of money on the black market. So unfortunately, it looks like some organizations haven't been proactive enough in terms of patching their software, or they may not even know, IT departments may not even know that people are using MoveIt. Depends on how well the IT environment's been used. And unfortunately, that's why it's the gift that keeps on giving. So every month or 2 months, we get another MoveIt hack where an organization's data has been stolen because they've not resolved their MoveIt software patching issues.
Is it fair to say that in North America, perhaps so even though that story might have hit the news this week, the incident might have happened 3 or 4 months ago, the kind of turnaround of incident to making it publicly knowledgeable can be quite a long period?
It can be, and actually this vulnerability was probably known to the criminal underground for a long time before it was actually made public in the first place. So you don't even know necessarily what data might have been stolen before it became public knowledge. And then ultimately what cyber criminals also do is, as soon as somebody releases a patch for a bit of software, they reverse engineer that patch to work out what the vulnerabilities that the patch is supposed to deal with, and then they'll create a malware or specific exploits to that sort of exploit that software. So ultimately what will happen is anybody who's not patching their software is then at risk of being exploited during that period. And that's why if you look at Cyber Essentials, they normally say you need to patch your systems within 14 days of that patch being publicly made available, because they are so quick in terms of reverse engineering that patch back into exploits. And actually, 14 days is probably still quite liberal. I think it probably takes days for some of these guys to be able to reverse engineer some of these patches, if not hours. So it's such a big issue because we're all dependent on software, and things like software updates is difficult to stay on top of for most IT organizations. But it's the big chink in the armor that cyber attackers always keep on exploiting.
Yeah. So by the sounds of it, we're going to keep on seeing stories about MoveIt in the media. Then is the takeaway there?
For the foreseeable future, and other software that gets exploited in the same way.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got a couple of open questions for us to consider. So the first one, why aren't more organizations reacting to the obvious and immediate threat of cybercrime? Because there's more than enough evidence out there that every organization should be. So that's the kind of first question, and then we'll move on to the second question in a moment. But yeah, I'd be interested in both your thoughts on the first question.
Just from my experience, and Mike's probably the better person to answer this question because it's a lot about perception of risk. But cybercrime and cyber risk isn't the only risk organizations need to manage. It's one of a very large raft of risks they continuously need to manage and continuously need to prioritize. And it really is sector dependent. So, for example, if you look at the charity sector, their mission is absolutely top. That's what they focus on. That's what all their resources go on to. Any of these sort of hygiene factors or factors that can reduce the risk tends to be of a lower priority. it's definitely changing in that sector, for example. But if you look at various industries, cybersecurity will have sort of a natural place in the risk in the list of risk priorities. And where it sits with that in that risk priority really probably comes back to Mike's side of things in terms of perception of risk, what the senior management leaders and leadership team actually sees that risk being as an issue. And obviously, if you've been victim to a cybercrime, the risk will be higher. If you've never been a victim to a cybercrime, then your perceived risk will be lower. But probably, as I said, Michael probably have a lot more insight on this one actually.
Well, yeah, thank you for that, Moritz. You know, the question, the way the words question, the way you've worded the question, it says obvious and immediate. I think those two words are something that they're not forefront, if you like, of somebody's mind. You know, business leaders will make decisions usually using information and data. They try to make informed decisions. I think the biggest thing that impacts the decision is budget. And they know that if you like, they were to take any of the advice that Moritz has already kind of shared with us, it's going to cost them money. And ultimately, you know, it's a bottom line, it's a profit thing, and so on and so forth. Are the kind of thing I think that would, you know, for a high-end business leader to make a decision on, those kind of things impact it. Really interesting with this sort of question then. If we remove that thing of cybercrime and change the dynamic, around about the 70s, Tversky and Kahneman wrote some work, and they spoke about that humans are risk averse, and particularly their paper they wrote was about they feel that the human psyche is that we, if you like, the potential of losing something can dissuade us from engaging in particular behaviours. And kind of to give that a really sort of like some different stats to the ones you've shared. If we look at flying versus driving, if you like, there is more risk if you travel 1,000 miles by car. The stats are that you are 1 in 366 times likely to have an accident in a car. But if you fly the same distance, it's 1 in 3.3 billion, the chance of an accident. So those stats are massively far apart. So what it's saying is that actually, if you like, the work that Tversky and Kahneman said is that our illogicness, if you like, because we always think we're rational decision makers, we are the furthest thing from that, have to be honest, is that our fear of flying would stop us flying and then we'll take the riskier route of driving. And that's kind of what's going on with cybersecurity, if you like, if you want to turn it around. And so in a way, these wonderful webinars that you put on, Richard, and please keep asking me to come along. It's nice to meet people like Moritz and yourself and hear how it kind of really works, because this for me is eye-opening, right? So when it says obvious and immediate, to me, no, and actually what you're doing is you're raising awareness. So I think that the things basically for me, that if you like, that early work that was done, it says that fear plays a part and anxiety plays a part in decision making. Again, within, you know, no matter how skilled someone might be as a senior leader, these things are innately in every human being. You cannot escape them. They are as much of our makeup as the next, if you like. You know?
Yeah. Yeah,
I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
We'll get to that.
Yeah,
for sure. And I guess this one's from Moritz, really, in terms of, you know, what could we give today's attendees as an immediate takeaway in terms of reducing their cyber risk? Sort of some quick actions, really.
I think just generally raising the awareness of the cyber threat within the organization will be an absolute key start. Just to give you a quick example, when we do our cybersecurity penetration testing, one of the things we do is look at social engineering staff to understand how susceptible they are to a phishing or phishing email. So what we're finding is phishing is getting increasingly harder because the technology is getting to the point where they can filter out spam emails. So what do? We revert to phoning up somebody, saying we're part of the IT company, please follow this link and put in your passwords. And without fail, people put in their usernames and passwords, and that's our first entry point. So I would say making people aware of the cyber threat that faces them as individuals working for your organization and also as private individuals is absolutely key, because that will help them make the right decisions. And then following on from that, you can then come up with a bit more of a detailed cybersecurity structure, which may include technical controls, may include policy and procedural controls, and further training for staff as well. But I think following from that point onwards, it becomes quite specific to what the cyber risk is to that organization.
Yeah. Picking up on what you just said there, I'm going to ask Mike for a very quick response on that one. So, Mike, why do people trust something more on the end, that someone on the end of the phone? What's kind of going on there that would make them less likely to be suspicious?
I think that you know, what, if you like, what we've been conditioned to do. Email happened probably about 1994, 95. Email began as a thing that became a regular occurrence in work. It was one way to be able to manage people. It's not my favorite way, because I think what we've learned to do is now have, like, you know, threads of emails where people can account for things that have been said or not said. They become the place where, if you like, we could get caught out or found out, or if we don't do what we say we do. So there's a more of an authoritative thing that we would possibly buy into, I think, is what might be going on. The thing that Moritz, I just really quickly, that Moritz picked up on, one of the things that I've been employed before to do is to come in and to actually take further forward that penetration testing, where you test to see what is the likelihood of people clicking on things. It is, how do you raise that awareness? Human sciences. Let's understand what heuristic thinking is. Let's understand how people give their trust. Let's see how well people are connected to their job and their work, and all these kind of things have an actual knock-on effect as to that decision that split decision that they make. If you know.
Yeah, so that's, we're kind of loosely touching on culture there, aren't we?
Mm.
So let's delve into cyber attack likelihood. A few more sort of interesting stats there. So sort of collecting a variety of different reports in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, there's pretty much a 4 in 10 chance that your business will suffer a cyber attack this year, but that's either directly on you or as part of a supply chain attack that then ripples out to you. And 75% of the people in our field of work are saying that cyber risk has increased due to geopolitics, AI, which I've already mentioned once, and remote work. Only 14% of small to medium-sized businesses rate their ability to defend themselves really as highly effective. And yet, of the businesses that we know that are reporting an attack, there's a big chunk of them that are saying they're being attacked every week. So some are getting kind of peppered every single week, more than once in some instances. We've talked a lot about phishing. It's still, and probably will always be, right up there. The most common attack method. It's human-based. It's social engineering in nature. Supply chain attacks increasing constantly. And that's a huge, significant year-over-year increase there between 2021 and 22. And I'd expect that to be, again, similar in increase for 2023. And very important to acknowledge, every organization is part of a supply chain. More ClearCom is, more Kingston Smith, Empowered People Thrive, Mike's organization. We're all parts of supply chains where we are a supplier or being supplied to. So that means that we have a risk to manage. So very much going down the risk psychology rabbit hole now. Very important, I think, to define risk, because it's important. It's a small 4-letter word we talk about a lot, but how do we really understand what risk is? So I won't read the quote, in the definition, but in terms of risk management, I think that's when we get into, it can be quite formal, but really there's the psychology of it, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And that's the key in terms of the thought processes. And this is a good example. And this isn't these next stats are not designed to get us talking about password management as a whole, but this is about the human mindset in terms of what's going on. So 91% of people know that password recycling, and that's where we use the same password in multiple or all of our different accounts. So that's just, we're talking about individuals in society now. So eBay, Amazon, Facebook, whatever it might be. So 91% of us know that that's a bad idea in terms of security. However, 59% are still using the same password everywhere. So 6 in 10 individuals in society are knowingly taking a significant risk. They're accepting that risk is the key phrase there, I think, with their cybersecurity. And these people, these members of society are essentially your employees and your colleagues, and they're carrying that mentality into the business environment. And this is really a question for Mike, really. So it's not, like I said, it's not about passwords at all. It's about the psychology of this. So Mike, what's going on there in terms of why people are acknowledging something's a bad idea but still doing it? Does that start in childhood? Or is in each individual separately programmed to look at risk in different ways?
I think that again, so this can be affected in different places around the world, but ultimately, human beings, if we didn't take risk, right, we'd stay at home, we'd do nothing. Nobody would have invented anything, and we'd be no further forward from the wheel. All right. If you like, our brain is rigged for what we call error-based learning. So whoever invented the wheel would have made many different attempts at it before they got the one that worked, right? And even in its infancy, that wheel has been developed further still over the many centuries since, hasn't it? And now we've got wheels in, sort of cogs in machines and all those kind of things. So for me, you've got people that, if you like, can be bungee jumping, and they're like thrill seekers. And you've got other people that would rather be, their feet on, terra firma, if you like. So the key things for me that I think inform the psychology of risk are there are biases. Those biases, I think sometimes we underestimate, because there are several different types of biases. There's unconscious bias and conscious biases. Previous experience can inform, if you like, the way that we view risk as a human being. I think a big one which is ignored, and one which is why it's sort of my passion is emotional intelligence, is that actually it's the feelings that go along with, if you like, cybersecurity. Give you an example, Marit's touched on a couple of times. If someone has experienced a cyber attack and it's hurt them some way, then their propensity or their level of thinking will be much higher than somebody at lower. And so I think one of the responsibilities, if you like, as a business owner is, let's make everybody aware, quite rightly on something you said, Richard, we are bringing things into the workplace. They don't work at home either, let's be quite frank, okay? But bringing it into the workplace puts an awful lot more people at risk than the person that delivers that risk. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So a big thing for me is personality plays a part. How can I say that? I remember talking to a young chap once, and we were talking about rugby, because where I come from, of course, a very rugby-based county. And this person was showing much more talent than possibly the side they were playing for. And I said to them, they were in about 17, 18. I said to them, do you know what? If I were you, project yourself 40 years forward, you've retired from rugby, you don't play anymore, you go watch. Do you want to sit and talk to your grandchildren and your children and tell them that you played where you played, or that actually you played at a higher level? And he looked at me and went, well, I want to play at the higher level. And I said, my tip to you is then go and do training sessions with clubs in higher leagues and see if you can't break into a development side and then end up playing. Now, that person ended up not only playing for that side, but ended up being the most capped Cornish captain to have won cups. Mm. So now he's got something to talk about. And here's the thing. At the time that I spoke to him, his risk aversion was, if I go and do it, I'll look stupid. If I go and do it, I'll fail.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, the psychology of risk is really, really, really interesting. The four things are, just to underpin what we just said: bias. We underestimate how it informs risk very much. It's something that we teach. Personality plays a part. And again, the brain is rigged for us to be error-based learning anyway as a human being. And the good thing is, though, is all of those things sound really negative and ooh, but for me, there are ways that we can, if you like, circumnavigate things like great applications like Gear Shift and Mood Kit help us to understand individuals' obstructive emotions or their cognitive distortions, if you like, distortions, should I say, not just distortions, that allow us to individualize even the awareness that's given to an individual, so that, if you like, you get what you need that helps you to not click quite so quick. That's quite good. That's quite good, isn't it? Not click quite so quick. There you go. There's a gimme for today. How did that happen? I'll be quiet. I'll keep right on for hours.
We'll trademark that one. Yeah. We've had, thank you, Mike. And we've had a question come in that I think is really important to address now. So the question is, when we talk about cyber attacks, as in 39% suffering an attack this year, is that the same as businesses suffering a financial loss from an attack, or does it relate to attacks that may lead to a financial loss? So essentially what we're talking about there is a cyber attack occurring. Would you be able to define a cyber attack for us, Maritz, briefly, just so that we can kind of make sure we're all talking about the same thing?
So a cyber attack would be, it could have various levels of success. So it might just be an attempt that you manage to sort of swat away with your controls or the measures you got in place, or it could all be all the way through to a successful cyber attack that actually led to financial loss. And I I think looking at the financial side of cyber attacks, it's not just necessarily the cost of the attack itself. It's also the management cost and the additional operational effort required around maintaining those or defending against those as well. Yeah. So potentially you may have had a phishing email that came in, somebody clicked on it, it started doing something on your network, and you had to rush to try and prevent whatever was happening. So you already had an element of cost there in terms of management cost, in terms of people cost, and taking the focus off the mission to be able to stop that. And obviously if that doesn't happen, potentially they can go all the way through to then a business email compromise or stealing data or putting ransomware and so on. So there's quite a degree of cyber attack. Just having a cyber attack potentially may have an element of cost.
Yeah, so a cyber attack by definition does not have to be successful in order to qualify it as an attack.
It's I mean, it could just be somebody spamming your staff and actually everything being caught in the spam filter, or somebody trying to carry out a denial of service attack on your website, but because you've got protections in place, you're not susceptible to that type of attack. So I think the problem is cyber attacks happen daily, and there's millions of them, and they're automated in many cases, and often they're just there to find that initial chink in an organization's armor. So actually that 39% is probably low generally.
Because, and that actually touches on the fact that the question that small to medium organizations might ask, well, why would anyone attack us? That kind of debunks that whole logic, doesn't it? Because it isn't personal, it is automated and widespread. It's not, they're not seeking, and there are businesses that are sought out, obviously, but a lot of the attacks are kind of widespread and just
opportunistic, really.
Opportunistic is the phrase. Yeah, thanks, Moritz. So a couple of questions again at this juncture. So definitely one for Mike, I think. What is the human psychology of risk? I know you've talked about it briefly there, but and why people do things even though it's a dangerous thing to do. And I think sort of reflecting on my own childhood, I was one of a group of about 6 or 7 kids growing up in the same street. I think every group of friends has one. It's the friend who does stuff and is always breaking their legs or arms because they're falling out of trees or falling off their bike or trying a jump that they were never going to make on their bike. And that kind of is really interesting to me in terms of that they were prepared to take the risk because the reward for them was there. And I guess that's what separates us out, I suppose. So and I know you've touched on it, Mike, but if you could sort of just briefly kind of run through that, your thoughts.
We've spoken about sort of what the risk is. There's something I wrote recently for a group of leaders, which is values-based leadership in action, and it tackles this thing of risk because what we want to try to achieve is making rational decisions, which is one of the things that we discuss within that program, if you like. For me, there are neuropsychology elements to it. So if you like, things like dopamine and stuff like that getting flushed into the body when we are, if you like, doing that risky thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sometimes our risk assessment of a situation, as you said, people falling out of trees, isn't as vigorous as it ought to be, or the safety that needs to be put in place. Why do we do dangerous things? Some people are, if you like, are more dopamine junkies than possibly they would care to admit. Does that make sense? The thrill of the chase and all those kind of things come into play, which is, again, one of the things for me about that thing of it's okay to raise awareness if we're going to be talking about reframing the way we think about the way brain processes what's going on, but it's also about making sure we individualize it to particular things. When it comes to things like this, the security of oneself and the privacy of information, forget technology, I'm a more cautious and always have been type person. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm more likely to tell you openly and outwardly about my emotions, how I feel about myself. But if you actually wanted to know the machinations of my mind when it comes to financial elements or, the privacies of one's own, home or mind, I wouldn't share that with you quite so openly. Does that make sense? So it would be more easy for Moritz to convince me not to click. But actually, if you spoke to my brother, it's the polar opposite.
Yeah.
Talking about his emotions, but you know, free reign, go and have a look, you know. And it's so, you know, there is no there's nothing I can give anybody that would say this is the definitive answer. It is about that thing of, first of all, let's raise awareness, talk about it. If you're going to do that with your team and do it as quickly as you can. I think, you know, and then, you know, it's that thing of specialist support, isn't it? If you actually want to take it just a little bit more down the road, by getting that support you need from people like Maritz and yourself, Richard, and people like myself, then the definition of risk in your organization is that you're doing something about it. A lovely word that I like using with senior managers, due diligence. Show me due diligence. If you believe you're not at risk, show me the diligence that says you know that is the case, that it is not an opinion, that it is based on some data, information, and some sort of record, if you like, you know.
Yeah, I think you've answered both questions in one there, which is really good. And I think one thing that sort of I was thinking when you were saying that, and I think Maritz probably experiences this, as do our data protection officers on the data protections and privacy side. I think that two things are kind of going on in society, really. One, I think, is that individuals and businesses, by and large, underestimate the value of personal data in terms of its importance, and its commercial value when it's in the wrong hands. Quite often when we see a cyber attack being announced in the media, the organization that's been attacked will quickly address the fact that no financial data has been affected, when actually that's probably less of an issue than the personal data that's been affected by the breach. So that might display a lack of understanding of how important personal data is in that context, aside from the legislation and UK GDPR, etc. But also I think there's just generally, and we've talked about this throughout, there's just an underestimation of the impact of what a cyber attack looks and feels like, and the subsequent impact of it. So let's talk a bit about leadership and risk management. Because we've got some really interesting facts here that I think would resonate with everyone on today's call. So a really good percentage of boards or senior management in the UK rate cybersecurity as a very high or fairly high priority. However, only 54% are acting to identify or assess their cyber risk. 13% of businesses assess risk posed by suppliers, which is quite low, or very low. 61% of businesses, large businesses, invest in staff training, compared to only 17% of businesses overall. That could be down to deciding where budget is spent, or it could be down to a lack of awareness. We don't know, probably a bit of both. One thing we do know, and I know that Mike and I have spoken often about this, is about culture and how that it must be led from the top. And kind of, it's a behavior, it's not something you can dictate. And Lindy Cameron, really good phrase from her in terms of board members' roles in their organization's resilience in respect of cybersecurity. Some really interesting research from the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So this is something that's really important to us as an organization, because it's important that we know who is making decisions in terms of investing in cybersecurity improvements. And we can see there that in large organizations where there's 250 staff or more, it's primarily the IT or data security specialist in the organization itself. That's down to probably their resources and the fact that they do have an in-house team, Maritz, I'd say, is probably what's going on there.
Yeah,
whereas maybe, yes, exactly, yeah. Then that requires budget and focus. Whereas anything from medium businesses down, it's generally the owner manager that's making those decisions, which is really interesting, because when we consider then that pretty much every business in the UK falls into that section, that sector, that size, it's the owner managers that are absolutely key. So if the owner manager of an organization in the UK maybe doesn't have enough of an understanding about cybersecurity or the impact of it in terms of where it should sit amongst all the other risks that they have to face, as Maritz mentioned right at the start, this isn't the only, we're conscious, you know, of the fact this isn't the only thing businesses need to worry about. That's really important, and it's essential that owners and managers of organizations do understand it. And in that same survey, looking at why businesses actually do then progress and proceed to invest in cybersecurity measures, the responses are really interesting, because there is definitely an awareness of the fact that customers and clients need to be reassured about security of organizations they're dealing with. A good number as well, and we see this with Cyber Essentials certification and Cyber Essentials Plus, that it's maybe a contractual requirement, maybe public sector, MOD, etc. It's definitely seen as a commercially advantageous area to focus on, and that's going to become more and more of the theme, I think, in the years to come. That if you're seen and can evidence your commitment to cybersecurity, it makes you more competitive in your space. But it's really interesting to me because this kind of sits quite neatly with an analogy of if we're driving down the road and we come to an area where there's a school and the speed limit drops to 20 miles an hour, do we adhere to that speed limit because we don't want to be caught by the police and be given a fine for speeding, or do we drop to that speed limit because we know it's ethically the right thing to do and we don't want to cause harm to anyone in that area? And that's it's obviously has nothing to do with cybersecurity, but I think it's about mindset and why we do things and what drives our actions. So there's definitely a good variety of drivers here in terms of why organizations are investing in cybersecurity.
I think the bit that worries me is the one that's right at the bottom, because I really believe that should be more towards the top.
Yes.
The fact that only 12% are putting cybersecurity in place because senior leadership said they should. And actually, that, to me, it should be the other way around, really.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting as well, isn't it, seeing the difference between the public sector asking for it and the private sector. 46 versus 13%. And that, and we definitely experience it with the public sector. I do a lot of work with the NHS. I know we work with other sort of major public sector entities, and it is definitely a procurement requirement, and so it should be. There's inevitably a time when that 13% for private sector contracts will rise up that chart. Hopefully, the sooner the better. But yeah, very interesting about why people and why organisations are making those decisions. So interestingly, I know we kind of touched on it a bit already, but what drives a leader to desire to invest or develop a cybersecurity culture is the right thing, or ignore it? I mean, we've probably touched on it in different ways. And are we in a world still where leaders or business owners convince themselves it won't happen to us? And Mike, I mean, when we get to that one, I'd be interested in that it won't happen to us psychology, what that's born out of. But yeah, feel free to address either of these questions as you see.
I would say the most responsive leaders, again, are those that have actually been subject or been involved in a cyber attack. They're the ones that, especially if it's had more than just a financial impact on an organization that they've been either been part of or led before, and it definitely sets the tone for that leader in terms of how they prioritize cybersecurity, and also it helps them identify what the things are that's got the most bang for buck within their organization from a cybersecurity perspective, because it's not just about chucking money and technology. I think that will help, but fundamentally, if you don't deal with culture, people, and process, then you still leave yourself open. I mean, we've done security testing on clients who've got £1 million kit in there to detect attacks, and it was fairly arbitrary to go around those because nobody was monitoring the systems to see if any alerts were being raised. So we continued doing what we were doing for hours before somebody happened to look at the screen and go, "Oh bugger, we've got a security incident happening." But by that stage, it's too late. So it's very much about it's not just about chucking money at the problem. It's about making sure that you address the problem at its root, and actually spend money where. And actually, to be fair, if you're clever, you don't have to spend that much money on cyber security. It's just about making sure that it's at the fore of people's minds, and there where the risk remains, where you can't just rely on people. That's where you put technology in place to make sure that you close off the other loop, the other sort of areas that an attacker could potentially gain as well.
Yeah, and that's so true. And we know that 80 to 90% of attacks are coming in through phishing. So by definition, if we just invest more time in awareness, there's this kind of misconception that cybersecurity is completely about tech, and it's completely about investing in more technology. And actually, awareness sits right at the top. And I mean, it all complements each other and it all knits together. Obviously, it all has its important place. But if for any organization focuses some time and effort on making employees aware of what a phishing email might look like, and as Maritza said, we do a lot of increasingly more work on phishing simulations to help organizations understand what the likelihood is of their teams clicking a link. I think that's a really good place to start. And in terms of the "it won't happen to us" mentality, Mike, we all do it. We all have that conscious inner conversation that we decide that's something that's not going to happen to us. fascinating subject. So where does that come from, and how powerful is the human brain in convincing us to do that something is the case when it's clearly not?
First of all, just to go back to the other question, I typed it into Google, the actual same wording, and on the first 3 pages of Google that it came back, including the adverts, there was nothing to do about human sciences. It was all to do with software. So if you like, if I were a business leader and I wasn't privy to this webinar, and actually for me, I started to think about it as being an issue I needed to look at, I would then rely on what Google told me. And let's be fair, who goes past page 3 when they're looking on Google? Hardly anybody. You would assume that it is, in fact, technological things that you'll buy. So that's really interesting. And so how do you change that? For me, there's a thing called effect heuristic, and we know what heuristic thinking is. And for those that might have never heard of it, if you can imagine that our brain is designed to keep us safe, that's what its real primary job is, safe from any kind of threat or vulnerability, from being attacked. When we get up from our armchair in the front room and we walk across the front room to, you know, the French doors, and we open them up and stand out on the patio, we might have to navigate walking around the cat, the dog, the coffee table, stepping over the threshold to go outside, and then stand on the patio. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Well, our brain, heuristically thinking, takes every one of those aspects of those potential risks and creates a landscape that we then can navigate to get to that door without panicking or actually going, you know what, I'm just going to sit in the chair. Okay, it's what happens. So effect heuristic is it's basically, or my point from learning about heuristic thinking is, if we know there's a landscape, let's put that landscape in your business. How do we inform that landscape then? Because actually we can decide where the coffee table is. We can decide where the dog may well or not be. And I know these sound like silly analogies, but it's the same thing in a business. And so changing that heuristic thinking is, just as you've been talking about all morning, Richard and Moritz, and that is, you know, let's become aware of it. Let's look at what phishing looks like. Due diligence, quite rightly, as Moritz said, is where actually is the problem first before we throw anything at it or do anything with it. What actually is it we're trying to identify? And where are the near misses? Have we got a log of the near misses? What's actually going on in real terms on a daily basis? And then from that, we can then start to approach it. To then go to this other question of what happened to us. Our brain can do 4 things, okay, with the information it processes. The first thing is it can distort it. So a distortion of information means that we can distort it to fit our own agenda in our own head. Does that make sense? Yeah. So again, you put the personality into the mix. Somebody like myself, who's maybe a little bit more cautious, can distort an information and go, ooh. If you then become my brother who doesn't, then of course the distortion is, it'll be all right. Yeah. When actually, you know, the risk assessment would need to be more thorough. The next thing we can do is delete important bits of information. So a simple thing that happens every day, you walk to your office and you say hi to someone, how are you? And I said this morning, I said to Moritz, I said, good morning, Moritz, nice to meet you. He went, morning, Mike. I said, how are you? And he said, I'm good. What Moritz failed to tell me and deleted from that conversation was he stood on the cat's tail, unfortunately, and it meowed and ran out the door, and he hasn't seen it since, but it will come back later. He burnt the toast as well. He doesn't really like burnt toast. And when he got to work, he had a couple of horrible emails. But the thing is, if I said to him, good morning, Moritz, how are you? And he then gave me that story, I'd be going, well, hold on. And he asked if you're okay. We're really good at deleting the important stuff. And sometimes with subjects like this, how do you inform your landscape? Actually, I need to know he's burnt the toast, and I need to, does that make sense? And if you then translate all of those analogies into cyber security, then all of those subjects become different things, obviously, we know. Another thing we can do is generalize it. The actual statement, it won't happen to us, is a generalized statement. And it's not specific enough. And if anybody were to ever use that with me, I would go, what isn't likely to happen to you? Is the question. And then the last thing is, and this is what we're trying to do, I guess, today, the last thing our brain can do with information, we can use something known as representational systems. What I mean by that is, if I said to you, think of a chair, your chair may be a Georgian piece of work, beautifully refined and carved with plush velvet. My chair might be something I can get from IKEA. Moritz's chair might be you know, something that is a swivel chair that he sits in work, okay? But actually, interestingly, we've all got a chair in our head. Yeah. Now, the key to representation system is, can we make that chair look the same? Or can we show people 10 different types of chairs and their value they bring? And so they're ways of being able to change this landscape, if you like, this heuristic thinking that we apply to work. Because you said it earlier on, Rich. I know I'm running on. I'm really sorry, stopping a moment. But you spoke earlier about this thing about we bring things from home into work, heuristic thinking. So are we being aware of that, and are we making those changes? And again, raising awareness is how we can help to change that landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've talked about before, so just sort of give a different spin on heuristic thinking. So my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, it's heuristics that allow us to drive 15, 20 miles on a motorway without thinking about it. And then we realized that we've just done that and we weren't conscious of our driving. And the opposite of heuristic thinking would be critical thinking. Is that right?
Yeah, we were. If you over criticized what you did when you drove on those 15 miles, let's say, what would happen, I believe, is you might pull over and not drive anywhere. Probably have a brown bag to breathe in and out of, and maybe go, do you know what? In fact, I'll walk.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's really good. Thanks, Mike. So we're just going to, as we get towards the end of the session, I'm conscious of time. So something that the team at More ClearCom would be absolutely delighted to offer everyone who's registered today and attended, obviously, is to provide, with our compliments, a digital cyber risk report, which would provide a hacker's eye view of your organization, which is really important to see from that perspective how a potential attacker might be looking at your organizational business. So we'd use your domain as a starting point, and we can identify the vulnerabilities that might be out there that could be exploited, and we'll then provide that into a report which might uncover any potential breaches or credentials that have been stolen, etc., etc. And the graphic just shows what that cyber risk report includes. I think this is a really important starting point in terms of assessing where you might be. It's a really good conversation starter in terms of where your organization might sit in terms of its cyber security position, and we would be obviously delighted to help you improve that position, reduce your risk. And of course, you can have a conversation with any of the three of us about anything we've talked about today. The slides and the questions that have been submitted will all be included in a report that we'll be sending out to everybody. And please reach out to any of us, as I said, and Mike's got so much more information that could be accessed in relation to cybersecurity or any other subjects in relation to your business and developing your team. So not getting too many questions in at the moment, so I'll just sort of finish just to make you aware of our next event. So we've talked about culture today, and I'm a huge advocate of culture being essential. I've got, obviously, I'm in the world of cybersecurity now. I've also forged a career in food manufacturing in the distant past, and culture and lean manufacturing. In my mind, you need a culture, and you need buy-in from your staff in order to significantly reduce your risk and make sure that all of your team are working to the same goals, especially when it comes to privacy and data security. So Thursday, 9th of November, again, we're starting at 10 a.m. and it'll be myself and my fantastic colleague Megan Mirza, who you may have seen on our previous webinar when we were talking about the first 5 years of the GDPR. So we'd like to extend an invite to everyone who's joined us today to join us again next time. We'll be talking about how you can create a culture of privacy and really reduce your risk as a result. And just finally, our contact details, More ClearCom. We're part of More Kingston Smith. Please contact us there. And like I said, individually, all of our contact details, email addresses will be sent out in the Q&A document. So Mike, Moritz, thank you very much. It's been really insightful. I know some subjects we've only been able to briefly touch on, and we could go down some really deep rabbit holes with some of it, but it's been really, really informative, really interesting, and has given us all a lot to think about. So many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.